Growing up, she made my childhood a living nightmare. I was 8 years younger than her, and from the moment I could walk, she treated me like I was some kind of plague that had infected our family. Every chance she got, when our parents weren't around, she'd grab me by the arm and shove me into that dark closet in the hallway. The one that smelled like old mothballs and dust. She'd turn the lock and lean against the door, making sure I couldn't push it open. I remember pressing my face against the cold wood, tears streaming down my cheeks, begging her to let me out. My small fist would pound against the door until they hurt, but she never opened it. Sometimes I'd be in there for what felt like hours, sitting in complete darkness, my legs cramping from being curled up in such a small space. The worst part wasn't even the darkness or the cramped space. It was hearing her voice through the door, cold and matter-of-fact, telling me that silence was better than having me around. She had this way of making me feel like I was taking up space that wasn't meant for me, like I was stealing air that should have gone to someone more deserving. Our parents worked long hours, and they trusted her to watch me after school. They had no idea what was happening in that house when they weren't home. I was too young and too scared to tell them. Part of me believed what she said was true, that I really was unwanted, that my existence had somehow ruined everything good in our family. The pattern continued for years. She'd find new ways to make me disappear when our parents weren't looking. Sometimes it was the closet, sometimes the basement, sometimes she'd just send me to my room and tell me not to come out until she said so. I learned to be quiet, to make myself small, to exist in the shadows of our house. I became good at reading her moods and knowing when to stay out of her way completely. Our parents never seemed to notice the tension between us. They were busy with their own lives, their own problems. When they were home, she put on this perfect act, the responsible older sister who was just trying to help out. She'd ruffle my hair and smile, and I'd stand there frozen, not knowing how to react. It was like living with two different people, and I never knew which one would show up. As I got older, around 13 or 14, I started to understand that what she was doing wasn't normal. I began to realize that sisters weren't supposed to make their brothers feel like burdens. But by then, the damage was done. I had internalized her message so deeply that I struggled to believe I deserved to take up space anywhere. I kept to myself at school, had trouble making friends, and spent most of my time alone in my room when I was home. The worst incident happened when I was 12. Our parents had gone out for their anniversary dinner, and she was supposed to watch me for the evening. I had been excited because there was a movie on TV that I really wanted to see. But when I went to the living room, she told me to go to my room. When I asked why, she got that look in her eyes, the one that meant trouble was coming. She grabbed me and dragged me to the closet, but this time was different. She didn't just lock me in and walk away. She sat outside the door for what felt like forever, telling me in vivid detail how my birth had ruined her life, how her parents used to pay attention to her before I came along, how she used to be special, and now she was just the older kid who had to babysit the mistake. Her words cut deeper than any physical pain could have. I sat in that darkness, my knees pulled up to my chest, crying silently. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of hearing me break down. But inside, I was falling apart. I was 12 years old, and I genuinely believed that the world would be better without me in it. That night, something changed in me. I stopped hoping that she would love me like a sister should. I stopped trying to win her approval. I just accepted that this was how things were. High school was a blur of keeping my head down and counting the days until I could leave. I threw myself into my studies, not because I was particularly ambitious, but because it gave me something to focus on other than the constant feeling of being unwanted at home. I earned good grades, not for praise or recognition, but because it was the only way I knew how to prove that I had value. When I turned 18, I left for college across the country. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving until the day before. I just wanted to disappear quietly, the way I had learned to do everything else. College was the first time in my life I felt like I could breathe freely. Nobody there knew about the closet, about the years of being told I was unwanted. I could be whoever I wanted to be. I built a life for myself slowly, carefully. I learned how to make friends, how to date, how to believe that I deserved good things. It wasn't easy. There were times when I'd catch myself apologizing for existing, or when I'd panic in small, dark spaces. But gradually, I began to understand that my sister's treatment of me said more about her than it did about me. Update 1. I graduated college and stayed on the West Coast. I got a job, found an apartment, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was living instead of just surviving. I rarely talked to my family. Holiday phone calls were brief and awkward. My parents would ask when I was coming home to visit, and I'd make excuses about work or money. The truth was, I couldn't bear to go back to that house, to those memories. My sister and I had no relationship to speak of. We'd exchange maybe a few words during family calls, but that was it. I heard through my parents that she had finished college too, that she was working and dating someone. I felt nothing when I heard these updates, not anger, not curiosity, just a kind of hollow indifference. She had been such a huge, terrifying presence in my childhood, and now she was just a stranger who happened to share my DNA. Years passed like this. I was 25 and had built what I thought was a pretty good life. I had friends who cared about me, a job that challenged me, and I was even in a serious relationship. I had learned to trust that people could love me, that I wasn't the burden my sister had convinced me I was. Most days, I barely thought about my childhood. I had worked hard to move past it, to not let it define me. Then one Tuesday morning, my phone rang. It was my mother, and she was crying. My sister had been in a car accident. She was in the ICU, and it was serious. The other driver had run a red light and hit her head on. She had been unconscious for 2 days, and the doctors weren't sure when or if she would wake up. I stood in my kitchen, holding the phone, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath me. My mother was asking if I could come home, if I could be there for the family. She said my sister's boyfriend had broken up with her a few months ago, and she didn't have many close friends. My parents were there, but they were struggling to cope with the possibility of losing their daughter. I told my mother I would think about it and hung up. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus on anything. Part of me felt like I should be happy. This was the person who had made my childhood a nightmare, who had convinced me I was worthless. But mostly, I felt empty. I realized that despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to wish her harm. That evening, I called my boss and told him I needed to take emergency leave. I booked a flight home for the next morning. I didn't really know why I was going. I just knew that I had to. Maybe it was because I was the only one who truly understood what she was capable of, and I needed to see for myself that she couldn't hurt me anymore. Maybe it was because I wanted to prove to myself that I was stronger than the scared kid who used to cower in that closet. The flight home was turbulent, and I spent most of it staring out the window, trying to prepare myself for seeing her again. I hadn't been back to my hometown in over 5 years. The hospital was on the outskirts of town, a place I'd never been before. My parents were in the waiting room when I arrived, and they looked exhausted. My mother hugged me tight, and my father just nodded, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. They took me to her room, and I wasn't prepared for what I saw. She looked so small in that hospital bed, connected to machines and tubes. Her face was bruised and swollen, barely recognizable. This was the person who had loomed so large in my nightmares, who had seemed like a giant when I was small. Now she just looked fragile and alone. I sat down in the chair beside her bed, and my parents left to get coffee. The room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the machines. I looked at her face, trying to reconcile this vulnerable person with the sister who had tormented me. I expected to feel anger or satisfaction, but instead, I just felt tired. Tired of carrying all this pain around, tired of letting her actions define so much of my life. Update 2. I ended up staying for 3 days before she woke up. My parents would come and go, taking turns sitting with her, but I found myself staying longer each time. I brought books to read, but mostly I just sat there, watching her breathe, thinking about everything that had happened between us. On the second day, something unexpected happened. I was sitting there reading when a nurse came in to check on her. The nurse was probably in her 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle voice. She asked me how I was holding up, and something about the way she asked made me feel like she genuinely cared. I told her I was fine, that I was just waiting for my sister to wake up. She looked at me for a moment, then sat down in the other chair. She told me that she'd been working in the ICU for 20 years, and she'd seen a lot of families go through situations like this. She said that sometimes the hardest thing wasn't the medical emergency itself, but all the unresolved stuff that came up when someone you love is fighting for their life. I found myself telling her things I'd never told anyone. About the closet, about feeling unwanted, about why I'd stayed away from home for so long. She listened without judgment, just nodding occasionally. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that stayed with me. She said that sometimes people hurt others because they're drowning in their own pain, and they don't know how to ask for help. I thought about that a lot over the next day. I started to remember things I'd forgotten or pushed aside. How my sister had changed after I was born, according to family stories. How she'd been the center of my parents' world for 8 years, and then suddenly she wasn't. How she'd struggled in school around the same time she started locking me in the closet. How she'd seemed to have trouble making friends. How she'd often seemed angry at the world. None of this excused what she'd done to me, but it helped me understand that maybe her cruelty hadn't really been about me at all. Maybe I'd just been the convenient target for all her own pain and confusion. Maybe she'd been a hurt kid too, just expressing it in a way that was destructive rather than turning it inward like I had. On the third day, I was dozing in the chair when I heard her voice. It was weak and scratchy, but unmistakably hers. She was asking for water. I called for the nurse, and soon the room was full of medical staff checking her vitals and asking her questions. My parents rushed in, crying with relief. It was chaotic and emotional, and I stepped back into the corner, watching. After the medical team left and my parents had a chance to talk to her, she noticed me standing there. I expected her to look away, to pretend I wasn't there like she'd done for years. But instead, she just stared at me with this expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't the cold indifference I was used to, or the anger from our childhood. She looked confused, maybe even surprised. My parents eventually left to call other family members and share the good news. I was about to leave too when she spoke again. Her voice was still weak, but I could hear her clearly. She asked me why I was there. Not in a hostile way, but like she genuinely couldn't understand it. I thought about lying, about giving some polite answer about family duty. But sitting there in that hospital room, with her looking so vulnerable and confused, I found myself being honest. I told her I didn't really know why I'd come, that I'd heard about the accident and felt like I needed to be there, even though we hadn't spoken in years. That I'd been sitting there for 3 days, just waiting for her to wake up. She was quiet for a long time after that. I could see her trying to process what I'd said, maybe trying to figure out if there was some angle she was missing. Finally, she said something that completely caught me off guard. She said she'd been having dreams while she was unconscious, dreams about being a kid again, dreams about the closet. Final update. What happened next was something I never could have predicted. She started crying. Not the angry, frustrated tears I remembered from our childhood, but deep, gut-wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere she'd kept locked away for years. She told me she remembered everything. Every time she'd locked me in that closet, every cruel word she'd said, every moment she'd made me feel like I didn't belong. She said that in her dreams, she kept seeing my face as a little kid, pressed against the closet door, and she couldn't understand why she'd done those things. She said she'd been so angry back then, so jealous and hurt, and I'd been the only person she could take it out on. She said she'd known it was wrong even then, but she couldn't stop herself. I sat there listening to her, and I felt something shift inside me. For years, I'd imagined what it would be like if she ever acknowledged what she'd done, if she ever apologized. In my imagination, it was always this big, dramatic moment where I'd either forgive her or tell her exactly what I thought of her. But the reality was quieter than that, more complicated. She kept talking, telling me about how guilty she'd felt over the years, how she'd wanted to reach out but didn't know how. She said she'd convinced herself that I was better off without her in my life, that I'd probably forgotten about the bad stuff and moved on. She said she'd never imagined I'd come to the hospital, that she'd expected to wake up alone. I found myself telling her about my life, about college, and the friends I'd made and the person I'd become. I told her about the panic attacks I'd had in small spaces, about the years of feeling like I didn't deserve love, about the work I'd done to build a life where I felt valued. I wasn't trying to make her feel guilty. I was just being honest about the impact her actions had had. She listened without making excuses or trying to minimize what I was saying. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that surprised me again. She said she was proud of me for building a good life despite everything she'd put me through. She said she'd always known I was stronger than she was, even when we were kids. We talked for hours that day. Not about forgiveness or making up for lost time, but just about who we were now. She told me about her job, about the relationship that had ended, about how she'd struggled to maintain friendships because she'd never learned how to trust people or let them get close. I told her about my relationship, about the career I was building, about the ways I'd learned to be happy. As the days passed and she got stronger, something unexpected started to happen. We began to see each other as real people, not just as the roles we'd played in our childhood drama. She wasn't just the cruel sister who had tormented me, and I wasn't just the unwanted little brother who had ruined her life. We were two adults who had both been shaped by our experiences but were trying to move forward. I stayed for 2 more weeks, helping her with her recovery and spending time with my parents. It wasn't like we suddenly became best friends or anything like that. There were still awkward moments, still times when old patterns would surface. But we were both trying to do something different, to interact with each other as the people we'd become rather than the people we'd been. The biggest surprise came near the end of my visit. She was getting ready to be discharged, and we were sitting in her room talking about practical stuff, how she'd manage at home, when she'd be able to go back to work, that kind of thing. Out of nowhere, she said she had something she wanted to give me. She asked me to look in the drawer of her nightstand at home and bring her something. When I got there and opened the drawer, I found a small wooden box I'd never seen before. Inside were dozens of things from our childhood, photos of us together, drawings I'd made in elementary school, little notes I'd written to her when I was too young to understand that she didn't want them. When I brought the box back to the hospital, she told me she'd been keeping these things for years. She said that even during the worst of our relationship, she'd saved these reminders of the times when I'd tried to connect with her. She'd look at them sometimes and wonder what would have happened if she'd been a different kind of sister, if she'd been able to love me the way I'd wanted to be loved. She gave me the box and told me she wanted me to have it. She said she didn't need to keep holding on to guilt about the past, and she didn't want me to feel obligated to forgive her or have a relationship with her. She said she just wanted me to know that despite everything, there had been a part of her that had always cared about me, even when she couldn't show it. I left town a few days later, and we've kept in touch since then. Not intensively, we're not suddenly close siblings who talk every day, but we text occasionally, and I visited again for the holidays. It's different now. We're different. The strange thing is that I don't feel like I needed to forgive her, exactly. It's more like I finally understood that the story I'd been telling myself about my childhood was only part of the truth. She had been cruel to me, and that had lasting effects. But she'd also been a kid dealing with her own pain in the only way she knew how. Neither of those things cancels out the other. I still struggle sometimes with feeling like I'm taking up too much space, with believing that I deserve good things. But I've also learned that healing doesn't always look like the movies make it seem. Sometimes it's not about dramatic forgiveness or tearful reconciliations. Sometimes it's about understanding that people are complicated, that families are messy, and that you can acknowledge someone's humanity without excusing their actions. My sister and I will never have the relationship we might have had if things had been different from the start. But we have something now that we didn't have before, an understanding of each other as real people with real struggles. And sometimes that's enough. Looking back, I think the most important thing I learned is that I didn't need her apology to heal. I'd already done the work of building a life where I felt valued and loved. Her acknowledgement of what she'd done was meaningful, but it wasn't what set me free. I'd already freed myself by choosing to become someone different than the scared kid I'd been. The closet doesn't have power over me anymore. Neither does she. And maybe, in a way, that's the best possible ending to this story.